Ready!
My review for Mega Man X4 has finally arrived, well over half a year after X3, and if I have the internet to believe, this is considered to be a big classic. Released in 1997 for the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, MMX4 often ranks up there as one of the most favorite installments of the X lineup and the Mega Man franchise altogether for many people. Critics at the time weren't exactly blown away by what they were experiencing, giving the game an average of around 75% according to Game Rankings. However, this score seems to reflect more a general disappointment about Capcom sticking with sprite-based graphics and the side-scrolling nature of the series, rather than concerns about the quality of the actual design. Here at Quickies Don't Cut It, the latter is mostly of interest, and since I had never played Mega Man X4 until I began production on this review, I was very curious to see how the game compares to its three predecessors. Is the lovely hubbub surrounding it justified in my eyes? Let's roll that beautiful transition and begin with the story. Oh, and to shed some light on why this video is so much longer than for previous X installments, even though this is the fourth, it's because it's been a while and my style has changed and evolved substantially. The events of Mega Man X4 launch with an unknown force attacking the giant floating sky lagoon, causing the place to crash into the city below and ending a staggering amount of innocent lives in the process. The human government believes that the new military army, Repliforce, has gone maverick and were behind the act of mass destruction, but Repliforce isn't very happy about the accusation. Out of pride, they start a war against humanity to claim their independence and build a nation solely for Reploids. Of course, it's now in the hands of X and Zero to put a stop to the Repliforce by taking down its most significant members, as well as the colonel and the general of the organization. That's the basic gist of the plot, and I think the setup works well enough to get the adventure going. Unfortunately, it is the finer details of the story where things fall apart. To let the cat out of the bag, near the end of the playthrough, it turns out to be Sigma who evoked the conflict between humanity and Repliforce. While I suspect that should have caught me by surprise, it really didn't, because one of the early FMV cutscenes we see reveals Sigma to be alive and well in his former body. More importantly, I wonder though, wasn't the Sigma computer virus unmistakably defeated at the end of X3? What happened in between these two installments? How and when did Sigma come back to life like that? Also, who the hell is this Irish chick we keep seeing a lot throughout? Okay, she's the sister of the Repliforce colonel. Well, too bad I don't have a clue about his origins either. Neither of the two have ever made the briefest of appearances in X1 to X3, yet somehow Iris is somebody Zero holds close to his heart, apparently. The game never cares to elaborate on any of this stuff or properly flash out other new characters like the spy, Double, and that is my main issue here. The story is needlessly messy and difficult to follow if you ask me. If you just roll with whatever random elements it throws at you and don't get hung up on anything, then I think it can be moderately entertaining for what it's worth. For once, the villains for the majority of the game aren't purely evil. They are relatable soldiers trapped in a conspiracy, and the depressing endings of X fearing the day he may go maverick and Zero reflecting on the loss of friends and loved ones admittedly pulled on my heartstrings just a little. Still, it begs the question why there was an attempt to write a more detailed narrative with all this drama and emotional baggage when little of it is explained or developed competently, if at all. My friend Jay of Jay's Reviews and Jay's Let's Plays, go check him out by the way, informed me that Mega Man Extreme 2 will make sense of a couple of X4's mysterious story components, but Extreme 2 came out years later and I feel justified in expecting X4 to logically resume what was concluded or left at a cliffhanger in X3. The amateur presentation of this ordeal doesn't exactly help. I mean, I could get behind the pre-rendered FMVs, I am by no means an expert on anime, so for all I know the scenes are bar fests, but for me they helped establishing a better connection with the characters and added a new dimension to the storytelling. To stop beating around the bush, however, the English dub is absolutely hideous, and that is no secret.
What do you think you're doing?
It's not too late. Stop the coup now!
Never.
If that's your decision, prepare yourself!
Not only is the infamous "What am I fighting for?" scream a big culprit, so is X's baby girly voice that doesn't fit him by any stretch of the imagination.
Wait, Zero! I'm serious!
Zero, if I become a maverick, you have to take care of me.
And I don't even know what to say about the performance for the Repliforce General. All I can let you do is listen.
It was our destiny to fight. My fate is sealed. I have no choice.
For as many people refer to Symphony of the Night for the worst voice acting in popular PlayStation titles, Mega Man X4 takes its cake. Virtually every character portrayal sounds out of place here to my ears, and I sincerely doubt many takes were done during these recording sessions. Thankfully, I'm done rambling about the story now, and I personally wouldn't consider it to be an important aspect of the Mega Man X experience anyway. The gameplay is where the stakes are high, and rest assured that numero 4 delivers on the goods. First things first, Zero has been promoted to a fully playable protagonist. That's right, no longer is he an extremely fragile help to X that can be called outside of boss fights like in X3. He now has his own campaign, complete with his own moveset and techniques to learn from bosses. Both characters go through the same levels and everything, and share their basic but also fancy acrobatics such as dashing and wall jumping, but the Blue Bomber sports his trusty arm cannon while Zero is equipped with the Star Wars lightsaber. This means challenges must be approached from a different angle with the latter. All of a sudden, you cannot keep a safe distance and blast away using guns. You gotta get up close and intimate with your targets. Depending on the circumstances, this won't always matter too much in the end, but I found especially with boss fights, it becomes trickier to attack and safely dodge whatever's coming afterwards. For me, Storm Owl and Magma Dragoon were noticeably more difficult playing as Zero than they ever were as X. To sort of balance that out, however, the lightsaber does have an eons larger hitbox than X's straight flying lemons. Sure, you can charge the X-Buster to match more or less the same volume, but Zero slashes can be chained instantaneously without any need to load them up. The staircase sections in Bio Laboratory are a perfect example of him having the advantage over X due to the enemies that can rest on higher or lower planes than you or bounce all over the place down the screen. Whether the game overall is harder as X or Zero is probably a subjective deal. There are many variables going on, including which playstyle somebody is more compatible with. But what I myself think is more exciting is the boosted lasting appeal. Replayability has always been a chief strength of the X titles, with the abundance of items and upgrades and the freely customizable boss orders. So having a second Maverick Hunter with a unique playstyle and assortment of techniques to toy around with next to that is the self-explanatory plus. Zero is also a delight to play, and the level design complementing the two heroes about equally well is to thank for that. There are instances where one proves to be more convenient than the other, as I explained, which does work both ways, just to clarify again, but I don't recall any obstacles or placements of foes feeling awkward or broken for either character. In the jungle stage, X can use the platforms on the left side here to safely take out these needle shooting guys, while Zero can hold onto the ladders, whack away, and let the big hitbox take care of them. And in one of the final stages, X can use the lightning web item to climb over this spiked wall here, while Zero can perform a double jump to achieve the same feat. This can go to show that the stage layouts have thought behind them, something I can confirm further in general. If you rush yourself, then you're going to be taking heaps of shots and whatnot to the face, but those who muster patience by observing their surroundings properly shan't go unrewarded for doing so. Most of the time, environmental hazards and enemy attacks are telegraphed one way or another, ensuring that players sufficiently skilled and swift with their button presses can find a method to avoid taking damage. This is already apparent from the opening stage, where many parts of the scenery collapse onto the ground, instantly killing you when you happen to get squished. Unlike Mickey Mania skeletons that drop out of thin air with no visual cues though, the majority of these rocks and blocks are visible beforehand, and the dash is a helpful tool to steer clear in time. Granted, the levels aren't flawless in this department all the way through. Bio Laboratory and Military Train have a tendency to throw guys at you with no warning and little time to react, and I think in moments like these it would have been beneficial to have the foe in question either be simpler to dispatch or enter the playground at a slower pace. A returning problem from X3 as well is that the screen sometimes sort of locks in place vertically at certain intervals, leaving you with no idea what to expect when you proceed down. Usually nothing's awaiting you, as shown in these two clips, but a small handful of instances where I unexpectedly fell into an enemy or whatever, or even a bottomless pit, did manage to sneak in. I cannot really come up with the defense for the camera to behave the way it sometimes does, but the good news is that my enjoyment of the game was never hampered by these minor quirks. Marine Base seriously should have been fine-tuned and tested more though. It's an auto-scroller with your character sitting on a speedy bike, asking the player to jump over shit, avoid shit, and blow up shit. I dig the concept of it and how it expands upon the mundane bike implementation in Mega Man X2. However, the execution suffers from the classic can't tell what the fuck is going on or coming up problem. This turns the level into a messy affair that is based more on trial and error than quick reflexes, and even when you memorize what's coming, it remains a daunting task to outlast the ride without crashing into all the mines and other junk. It's only fair to applaud you now here, Mickey Mania. Your skateboard section in the Mad Doctor is far superior for being perfectly playable on the very first try. Regardless, Marine Base does highlight one of the elements about Mega Man X4 that I really like: the stage variety. Air Force and military train test a lot of your straightforward combating baddie skills and partially have you sitting in ride armors, while the Volcano Place is more about timing jumps over pits or periodically clinging onto walls to avoid taking hits from burning rocks. Biolaboratory mostly consists of vertical progression by means of climbing ladders, wall jumping and boarding an ascending elevator, and the first half of Snow Base takes place in a freezing landscape with ice physics, appearing and disappearing platforms, and even a set piece where you have to hurry up to prevent yourself from plundering into underlying beds of spikes. None of this stuff is exactly revolutionary by 1997, but how most stages have their own focus or gimmicks gives us a sense of polish and care, and it mitigates repetition. Cyberspace does deserve a shout out for originality though, as the goal is to clear obstacle courses filled with enemies and scalable layouts before time is up, emphasizing the exploitation of X and Zero's movesets to successfully and swiftly maneuver through the environment and around threats. All in all, X4 has a strong set of 8 main stages as far as I'm concerned, cemented by the fact that almost every bit of space in the map seems to serve a purpose. The only exception that directly springs to my mind is the second area of Snow Base, where you blast your way through a large blockade of ice cubes. You can advance to the bottom here, but you don't get anything for doing so. I think they should have placed the item you can find at the top of the maze, where the path to the boss is also found for your information, at the bottom instead, to give both the top and bottom something of value. That is a nitpick in all honesty, as the locations of upgrades and items overall is not too shabby. Heart containers are obtained in a variety of ways, be it by hopping on a platform before it's obliterated by a giant laser, or using weapons or upgrades from different stages to reach them. Most aren't as much about finding them as they are about realizing a solution to get to them, whereas X's upgrades are where sprinkles of exploration are mixed in on top of that. The leg expansion in the jungle stage is placed in an obvious, accessible spot to train your mind to be drawn to suspicious looking set pieces, but the following upgrades will require a more curious eye and light puzzle solving to actually make your way to the capsules. Using the lightning web as an extra wall jump surface in Air Force to safely squeeze yourself through this clusterfuck of spikes is really clever, and I like how it remains tricky to pull off even on repeated playthroughs. But blasting away this tall stack of rocks in Magma Dragoon's lair is honestly quite arbitrary. It requires you to unleash a charged twin slasher shot specifically, but is there any sort of cue that hints to this? No, you just try every combination till something finally works. Once more, I'm going to rave about cyberspace here because of its awesome speedrunnish gimmick. By conventional means, you need an A rank to advance to the next section, but if you're Sanic enough to score an S rank, an item awaits you in the next chamber. This really incentivizes the player to optimize their routes and performance in all 3 sections to acquire all 3 items. And the cherry on top is that the game never tells you about the S rank. It lets you discover its existence yourself. Marine Base appropriately has the worst placement for an item, where you have to execute this jump followed by a boost jump while blasting away at the same time to blow up interfering containers in order to obtain an energy tank. Like the stage itself, it's trial and error at its finest. You're guaranteed to miss the tank when passing by the first time, and snatching it up with the knowledge of where it is still easier said than done. Trust me. All things considered, however, the quest for amassing all the items and upgrades is nicely streamlined. Nothing felt obtuse, as I got everything without having a single peek in a guide, and there is a good toss-up between items that you can pick up from the get-go and ones that ask for fluff from another stage. As a result, there will be plenty of suspense and returning to previous levels on your initial playthrough, but if you plan your stage orders properly, you only ever have to revisit 1 stage as X and 0 stages as 0. In my books, that's a sweet spot. Diving into the items and upgrades themselves now, the number of refillable energy tanks one can acquire has first of all been reduced from 4 to 2. I myself don't mind it, to be frank, as I feel 4 energy tanks was perhaps somewhat generous, leaving room for careless brute forcing and that type of jazz. It does irritate me that you still have no control over how much you want to use from a given energy tank. X and 0 always consume the entire bottle with no regard for how much they currently even need. Now, replacing the 3rd and 4th energy tanks from X1 to X3 are 2 new tanks, each with a unique application. The first is what is called EX Tank, which defaults the life counter to 4 instead of 2 upon future game overs. Very pleasant to have for more retries on bosses. And the second is the Weapon Tank. Its purpose is obviously storing amassed ammunition, and I warmly welcome its inclusion. I mean, why not offer players an option to recharge their firearms, right? For 0, it comes across as a bit of a waste since he only has 1 technique reliant on weapon energy, but for X, 1 full tank actually pumps up all your weapons to full ammo count. That's not bad at all and makes the weapon tank highly worthwhile. Sort of. There is a little bit of a niggle when you manage to find a beefed up helmet for X. You see, this wonderful upgrade gives you infinite juice for all of his weapons, and to be blunt, I think that's dumb. If it were my decision, I would have gone for 50% reduction over full-on 100% reduction. In case you want to get particular, yes, charged weapon shots still drain weapon energy, but having both the weapon tank and this overpowered helmet in the same game comes across as superfluous nonetheless. Wouldn't you agree? Well, ignoring the dodgy helmet, the other suit expansions available for X are fortunately pretty cool. To begin with, the legs allow him to perform mid-air dashes like in X2, as well as suspend himself from the ground for a brief moment when pressing the jump button again at the desired height. Improved maneuverability leaves me with little to bitch about, and hovering around can form a reliable strategy when it comes to sustaining a certain altitude as to stay in line with nearby enemies or dodging a short streak of attacks or enemies running across the floor. Next up is the armor upgrade, which absorbs 50% of the received damage, making for twice as much health, and transforms it into energy for the Nova Strike, a giga attack where X performs a flying horizontal tackle. It's not a powerful offensive capability against bosses, but it can be exceptionally handy to plow through enemies when you're in a tight spot, and it's ready for use again surprisingly quickly after the last activation. If I may whine shortly, I do miss the option to put a meter for the Nova Strike on screen, as having to open the pause menu each time to check kind of diminishes its convenience and instant nature. Last but certainly not least, there are 2 variations of the arm upgrade to pick between. One grants you the ability to charge up to 4 charged shots at once and release every individual one whenever you want, whereas the other makes your charged shots XXL sized, giving it the power to penetrate through walls and leave behind plasma balls that continue inflicting damage on the victim. I found the former very useful when waiting for a boss to make his move and consecutively releasing 4 charge shots after the fact, albeit the latter is widely accepted to be the superior option overall. Perhaps the 2 could have been closer to one another in their potential, but I do really appreciate the concept of experimenting with 2 upgrades that cannot be equipped simultaneously. With that laundry list of upgrades and shit covered, I am bummed out to tell you that the special expandability from the last game doesn't return. The chipsets that can enhance one specific body part of your choosing a second time are gone, and so is the ability to freely choose from a selection of acquired ride armors at their summon points. The levels here give you the mech they see fit giving you, just like in X1 and X2. If you've seen my Mega Man X3 review, you might remember me stating that it was perhaps my favorite of the SNES trilogy. I cannot say I'm sure sure I still feel that way, but I do know that the one reason I ever claimed that in the first place had to do with all of the added depth over X1 and X2, giving the game an edge in replay value. True, not all of those new features in X3 were terribly well executed, but with this being the follow-up installment, improvements could have been realized where necessary. Instead, X4 opted to drop X3's unique elements and to rub some more salt into this wound. X4 also doesn't have a little side quest a la the X-Hunters or Bit Bites and Vilemark 2 to slightly alter later stages or the ending. Arguably, this harkening back to the relative simplicity of X1 could be viewed as a positive. Sometimes less is more, you know, and heaps of folks swear by X1, but I personally find it disappointing. I loved how many things there were to collect in X3 and how they affected the course of the adventure in numerous fashions. Having Zero as a fully playable character here evens things out to an extent, but that missed potential stays. Now, it's worth mentioning once more that none of the discussed upgrades are a part of Zero's repertoire. In fact, he doesn't enjoy any suit expansions. He does collect the same 8 heart containers and 4 tanks as X, but otherwise he powers up solely through the 8 techniques learned from the 8 main Reploid/Maverick bosses. These range from a double jump to a fire/uppercut and from a mid-air dash to a downwards ice thrust. The more agile Zero becomes, the better he can traverse stages and the more secrets he can find, and the more attacks he learns, the easier enemies in your way can be rid of. I've managed to find a minimum of 1 practical use for all the techniques, like whipping out the electric lasso against foes across a gap or freezing fire to avoid pending damage, but I do think that Kuen Zon, easier pronounced as the screw attack, renders the rest of the attacks a little obsolete during stages. It's immensely powerful and versatile, but alternating between techniques whenever possible and applicable does lead to some pretty badass sights. Shallow, thou sayest? Mayhap, but who wouldn't feel like a goddamn guru when sequentially pulling off all these stunts? Sealing the deal is that everything is painlessly executable at a whim with simplistic button combinations for each technique. Regrettably, this degree of direct input is just not in the cards for X and his assortment of weapons. Whereas, for example, up on the D-pad and the action button simultaneously feels perfect for Zero's uppercut move, X's secondary firearms all have particular and intricate properties that do not translate over to button combinations without clashing or feeling unnatural. Scrolling through your guns one by one with the shoulder buttons is about as good as it gets, and that is no fault of the developers. It is the inherent limitation of controllers to intuitively mimic or map such a vast range of operations. Maybe an item system in the ballpark of Ocarina of Times would have worked with the amount of buttons available on the PS1 and Saturn pads, but something tells me it might not fit the pacing of a side-scrolling run-and-gunner all that well. In any case, the clunky management is the sole reason why experimenting with weapons in Mega Man games has never appealed to me all that much, especially because some enemies completely deflect certain types of weapons. Sticking to the default arm cannon during the stages plainly seems more convenient and less dangerous. Once I have found many of their situational applications and uses, I do frequently start using secondary weapons over the Buster, but that learning process, it's always somewhat of a struggle. That's not to say X's actual weapons in MMX4 aren't solid. I think few are too powerful compared to others, something that does not apply to X1 with the Storm Tornado and the Fire Wave, as well as the Charged Chameleon Sting actually making you briefly invincible. Neither do they come across as borderline useless to me like much of X2's selection. The ideal item to use is pretty dependent of the structure and enemy placement in the current level section. When enemies are clinging onto a wall below you, you can use the Twin Slasher. The Double Cyclone proves to be a star in taking out bad guys in an arc far above you, and the aiming laser can clear out multiple foes at once within decent range. There are a plethora of possibilities to approach situations, too much for me to go ahead and figure all out, but that does enhance replay value if you're into that stuff. Not not just on the subject of combat either. The rising fire can create small shortcuts in the jungle stage, and the lightning web is a fantastic all-round tool for platforming by giving you an additional wall jump surface. To reveal one of my dirtiest secrets, Mega Man weapons really are not my strong point when it comes to praising or criticizing their utilities and balancing. But one staple gripe I have with so many Mega Man games is unfortunately not resolved: how brutally the weapons shatter the bosses when the correct ones are used. 6 out of the 8 main bosses in X4 suffer from Spark Mandrill syndrome. Yes, I stole that term from the completionist, shut up. Meaning that the items they are weak to can trap them into an endlessly repeating loop until they die, with little to no opportunity to attack you anymore. I am convinced that rather than rendering these bosses practically defeated as soon as the fight begins, it'd be so much more interesting and satisfying if the player received a decent but certainly not too big advantage. Observing the Twin Slasher, the ideal firearm to use against Web Spider, we notice that the shots do not break his AI, neither do they inflict serious damage. The usefulness of the Twin Slasher instead lies in its 2 diagonally traveling projectiles. The top one to make hitting Web Spy, okay, that is getting a bit old now. The top one to make hitting Web Spider itself less taxing, and the bottom one to slaughter these mini spiders crawling along the floor. This is the type of balanced design that X4's bosses needed so much more of. I'll repeat, 6 out of the 8 main bosses are laughable jokes with their respective weaknesses in X's campaign. That's insane, and it most negatively impacts the boss rush that takes place right before the showdown against Sigma. It's just a slog of effortlessly annihilating 75% of the encounters, one by one. Upgrades, heart containers, and tanks aren't even really relevant in this equation. For Zero, on the other hand, it is incredibly evident that the boss rush is far more challenging, and why that isn't any rocket science. Not counting that Ayuin Gene completely steamrolling over Cyber Peacock, the techniques Zero learns don't cause the bosses to get stuck in a stun loop, or at least not close to as much as with X. Certain techniques are more beneficial to use against certain bosses, but not to the degree you can sit back, relax, and relish the show. Yeah, Raku-Hu-Ha is effective against Storm Owl, but you still need to time and aim your precious shots carefully in order to remove a decent chunk of his health bar. Yeah, Raijin Geiki is effective against Magma Dragoon and Slash Beast, but you'll have to rely on it wisely as you're left wide open to get ambushed until the attack animation is finished. Of course, the double jump and air dash are also going to be of great assistance, but what I'm trying to get at, even when Zero is decked out with a full health bar and all 4 tanks, you're gonna have to put in some effort to survive the boss rush and make that victory happen. I'm so glad this is at least the case for Zero. If I may leave a suggestion for when playing as X, I think all of the game's bosses are the most fun when you stick to the good old X-Buster. Doing so brings out great fights that you'd otherwise only really cherish in that manner as Zero. Whether it's dodging 2 separate copies of Split Mushroom and punishing the real one whenever he's idling, or finding a rhythm and travel arc to jump over or dash under a streak of Cybercock's explosive chase missiles, you'll have to brew new plans and strategies for all of them. The following may vary wildly from person to person, but half of the 8 main assholes, that being Web Spider, Cyber Peacock, Jet Stingray, and Frost Walrus, I found very manageable to take down all naked as both X and Zero, while the other half, including Storm Owl, Magma Dragoon, Split Mushroom, and Slash Beast, demanded me to examine attacks and moves and behavioral patterns, and then act upon what I've learned with quick reflexes. Patience and trial and error play a significant role in outclassing these bosses, but seeing your dedication pay off by nailing one of them with a tiny portion of health left is so darn addictive and gratifying. What makes fighting these bosses without any upgrades or secondary items all the more enticing is that you do not have handicaps placed on you in an attempt by the developers to artificially extend playtime. There is no bullshit like needing the electric spark in order to make Armored Armadillo a remotely equal opponent to you, or the possibility to completely miss the dash for a long time like in X1, which is a crucial upgrade to properly take on most of the Mavericks. X4 is much like X2 in that all the 8 main stages are well beatable as first choices. Considering that one half half is, in all fairness, harder than the other half though. Maybe a setup in the vein of Mega Man 7, where the first set of 4 levels is followed up by a second set of 4 levels, would have been appropriate to pace the difficulty more naturally. Not a huge deal if you ask me, but I figured I should acknowledge that. Anyway, another tweak X4 brings to the table that I am really fond of is that running out of lives boots you to the beginning of the current area, not the entire stage. Being sent back to the 50% mark of a stage when getting a game over feels far more forgiving. While I am fairly confident that X4 stages are longer than X1s and X2s, making this seem like a pointless argument, by fair means or foul, it psychologically just felt like less of a hassle to me to trek back to the boss rooms. In my utopia, you would always respawn at the latest checkpoint when dying, but then the value of lives would be lost altogether, so I understand where Capcom was coming from with the 2 areas compromise. Sadly, Mega Man X4's final bit, so all the content after the 8 main stages, kinda fell flat to me. These final levels are perhaps the weakest final levels I've gone through in an X game to date. They're not poorly built or anything, but they're easy, short, and do next to nothing I deem as remarkable. The most optimistic compliment I can dish out is that the second round splits into 2 pathways, so credit where credit is due. I will also say I cannot get enough of the second face-off against the Repliforce Colonel, and how X and Zero battle Double and Iris respectively is pretty cool. But the Repliforce General Boss, oh man, the Repliforce General Boss. He is okay to go up against as X because you can shoot away from a large distance, but as Zero it's a bit of a different story. When the General shoots out his hands as platforms for you to reach his weak spot, he also fires blue energy rings that always nudge in your direction, and I swear, avoiding damage is just not conceivable. As a result, your safest course of action as Zero is staying on the ground when the General uses this strategy, but that means you'll likely be participating in a nightmarish waiting game as this idiot likes to do it over and over, again and again, time after time. There really should have been a more intuitive way to properly dodge the rings when boarding his hands. That is, if there even is one to begin with. Things only get worse with the final boss setup, which can outright blow me. Let me make loud and clear, I see little to nothing wrong with Sigma's second and third phases in and of themselves. The second phase is one of those where you'll get hit a ton and initially feel it's impossible to avoid so many attacks, but with practice you'll master your tactics and it's fucking awesome to win the battle with practically no damage taken. And the third phase, while rather complex compared to earlier last bosses with 2 targets to destroy and diversified ambushes, is nothing ridiculous or frustrating. What can make the endgame such an incredibly tedious endeavor is that there are no decent possibilities of refilling your energy tanks. At the very best, you can purposefully die over and over to return to this checkpoint right before the boss room to refill with this 1 health pickup right here. That's already bad enough in itself, but alright, I seek a farming spot elsewhere in the game, waste a seizable chunk of my time, head back to the final weapon stage, and...
Ready!
No God! No God, please no. I have to redo the boss rush all over again to reach Sigma? Are you joking? I'm not even allowed to farm in another stage without repercussion? What if I want to find some more upgrades, heart containers, and tanks I may have missed? You know, to increase my chances of defeating Sigma? None of the X games on the Super Nintendo make the boss rush and the final boss part of the same level. Even saving and shutting off the console to kill Sigma another day pulls the same prank on you. What a garbage design choice. This is worse than X3's achingly tiring farming, and it makes X1's wall raping for a couple of minutes seem like a godsend by comparison. I need to find something positive to talk about to prevent myself from ranting on here, so let's see. I got it. Mega Man X4 looks graphically fantastic, and the leap from 16-bit to 32-bit is definitely strong with this one. Initially, the sprites and their animations felt off and weirded me out somehow, but I quickly grew to like them and I started adoring the game's general theming. I've gone to great lengths already talking about the varied stages gameplay-wise, but the same applies on the front of visual design with distinct settings and all the memorable set pieces, and I genuinely believe the use of color and layering is the most gracious the X lineup has seen so far. From the lush jungle environment with animating waterfalls and water streams to the steaming red-hot volcano with bubbling lava at the bottom and fire dancing from spot to spot, there is a sense of life and detail here that I simply didn't get in the SNES counterparts, especially X1. Maybe it isn't fair to stack different generations of consoles against each other, but the art style here pops out. It weirdly clicks with me, and I am unsure if that is the result of more advanced hardware. What I am sure of is that more processing grunt is the factor that completely eliminated any and all signs of frame drops and slowdown. These are foreign terms to MMX4's vocabulary, regardless of whether it's running on the PlayStation or the Saturn. And praise the sun, what a relief that is after fiercely dealing with the struggling engine for 3 titles long. This is the part where I normally would bring attention to differences between 2 or more console releases. However, the PS1 and SAT ones are uncommonly faithful to one another. I saw that the Saturn version employs dithering tricks to fake transparencies, while the PlayStation version renders them natively, and the Saturn version contains a heatwave effect that distorts the background in hot locations, something the PlayStation version lacks. Apart from the Saturn version having notably faster loads as well, there are literally no other graphical and technical nuances that I could pick up on. The sound effects are marginally different to my ears, and the compression quality of the streamed audio files also appeared identical. The Saturn version does have the upper hand in one last category, that being seamlessly looping tracks. In the PlayStation version, songs reach an end and then restart from the beginning. I suspect because the system's disk drive falls short of meeting the read speed requirements for looping, but I haven't found convincing evidence for this. As for the soundtrack itself, my search for an X1 OST killer carries on, and I was hoping X4 would be ending it. The Sky Lagoon theme for X, heard in the intro of this video by the way, is astonishingly catchy and badass. It might be my favorite Mega Man X piece I've listened to so far, and the character and level selection songs had excelled in pumping me up. The bar was set. Shamefully, most of what followed is perfectly satisfactory, yet not nearly as marvelous in my opinion. I'm aboard for the Japanesey power rock flavor that is prevalent throughout a big dose of the songs, with the subpar SNES samples making room for exquisite computer-synthesized instruments. It's just that compositionally, X1 left a much bigger impression on me. In the moment X4's tunes are playing, I will often cautiously hum along, but a lot of them don't stick to the degree that I will remember them well after my play sessions, if you get what I mean. I'm not exactly comfortable ranking the soundtracks from best to worst between X2, X3, and X4. However, I will say that X4's is quite solid in its own right. It elegantly blends together with the visual design and gameplay, and music like the jungle, the Air Force, the military train, and the regular boss fight theme are my jam. So, to speak in response to the key question I asked in the opening paragraph, is the lovely hubbub surrounding Mega Man X4 justified in my eyes? I would say so, reflecting on everything I've addressed in this video. The game does seem to go back to basics by ditching X3's innovative new features, and as such, I am a little disappointed in a sense. And also not surprised it has been described as an underwhelming rehash by some fans in spite of its popularity. For all we know though, the safe take may exactly be why X4 is as solid and smooth as it is. The final portion of the game may have failed to hit the ball out of the park, but the majority of the regular levels are well made, varied, and unforgettable in my opinion, and the boss battles, while still foolish pushovers with the correct items as X, are a lot of fun to fight otherwise due to competent AI programming and what I would largely consider fair and satisfying difficulty. X's weapons and upgrades may not be of X3 caliber impressive, but I'd say they're easily a notch above X2's selection and better balanced than X1's, and the mediocre story and awful English dub don't ruin the gameplay at all. Toss in the fact BS design rarely rears its ugly head, emphasis on rarely, an addictive and efficient item fetching quest, the replayability brought forth with both X and Zero being fully playable, visuals that are absolute eye candy for me, and a good CD quality soundtrack gluing the whole package together, and Mega Man X4 may just be my new favorite X title. For now at least, I'm a flip-flopping, indecisive sag of shite. Hey, I don't think it's a competition anyway. All that really matters is that there is yet another Mega Man installment well worth picking up if you haven't done so already. Especially if you own or can get your hands on the cheaply available Mega Man X collection for the PlayStation 2 or GameCube, you'd be doing yourself a disservice not to have a crack at X4. It's a great video game, period.